Good afternoon. Let me start with some of the positive energy you wanted, Mr. Ryan. The board has often been a punching bag for people upset about the administration of elections, but in this case, you deserve credit for doing it right and doing it well. This was a first-time endeavor for a lot of folks, and to put that together pretty seamlessly and very responsive even ahead of the time. I know Chairman Myrie and myself spoke to you frequently in the days leading up to the opening of early voting, and you were receptive to suggested changes, and the results, I think, are there for all to see. So thank you for that, and to your staff as well. That being said, we got through the preseason, I feel like, in one piece, but now next year is going to be the regular season, and we are going to have to anticipate a much larger turnout and a much larger demand. And so I had 2 quick points to make about it. Number one, the cards that you distributed with the intention and the effect of speeding the lines along, I think, are great. But there was the case that people were confused and thought it was a requirement to have with them, even though it was made clear that that was not the case. And I was receiving reports from some voters who were suggesting, whether it was an error by the poll workers or by them themselves in understanding it, that they were being asked for it before they were permitted to vote. That's obviously unacceptable.
Right.
And to the extent that that's something that requires additional training, I would ask you to focus on that, and also educating the public that that is not something they need in order to vote. And secondly, we're going to need a lot more sites. Obviously, I think the turnout would have been even higher. I mentioned this to the state board representatives had we had more sites, because I spoke to a number of people who indicated they would have voted early, but the trek to get to the early voting site was so much farther than their actual election day site that they just waited until the Tuesday to actually vote. And so I guess to the extent I have a question, it's what is the plan? Do you have any sense already of how many more sites we intend to have, or what the increase is going to be to accommodate that? I know in Queens, for example, we anticipate a countywide election just in February, so it's right around the corner for us. And so I'm curious what the planning is for that.
So the commissioners determined yesterday that we should open up our process to a period of public commentary. So we have on our website now, if you go on there, we're inviting commentary from the public to give feedback about their early voting experience, it's basically they can email us and say whatever their observations are, whether it has to do with sites or some other element of the process. And it's not limited to early voting. I'm sure we'll get comments about other things. That process is going to run through December the 17th. Largely in respect to some of the observations that you just made, Senator, with respect to Queens. We have an election, whether it's in February or March, depending on the timing of it, we're still going to have to conduct early voting with respect to Queens County. So that's going to mean that Queens is going to have an election in February, March, an election in April, and an election in June. And it stands by itself with 1.3 million voters, a large city all unto itself. So we have a lot of work to do. I can tell you that this board and the Board of Commissioners are committed to a substantial increase in the number of poll sites. The better situation that we find ourselves in now, as opposed to last year when earlier this year when it first passed, is we know what an early voting site looks like now. We know what the equipment we're going to be using there. So even if we have to ultimately purchase more equipment, we're purchasing more of the same. It's a known quantity. We know what the electric demands of these locations are, the equipment is, so that we can hopefully better choose the locations. But I will say this about locations. This has to be an all-hands-on-deck approach with respect to site assessment and with respect to site selection. When we first started this process back in the spring, there was absolutely no city procurement process for securing purely private sites. By that I mean private locations that do not have a tax exempt status, that might be willing to serve as poll sites. We had no mechanism to pay them. We now have a rubric that we can follow by utilizing a license agreement and tailoring that to purely private sites. So that may open up more locations for us. But with that comes its own set of concerns. And we need I think, two things. A broader authority from the state legislature to designate locations, and some structure of what compensation should look like for these locations, so that we have some beacon to point to, so it's just not open-ended, and that we're coming to these locations hat in hand, and they feel as if they can, take financial advantage of a circumstance because we have a specific need at a specific moment in time. So those things, those two things are things that I think are worthy of a full-throated discussion, and there are a lot of intelligent people in this state, and we should be able to put our minds together to figure out how all of that can work. And I believe that we need apart from that, a commitment from all levels of government that the buildings that are otherwise operated by government can be available for voting. And if that's the case, we have a robust team of surveyors that can go out and assess those locations for suitability, particularly Americans with Disabilities Act compliance. And we have done a great job making those locations that don't specifically meet the ADA requirements for voting accessible by temporary means. And we have 17, think about this. 5 years ago, we had none. We now have 17 temporary ramp vendors that we utilize throughout the city, just to put on the election events that we have now. So there is a focus on early voting. And I would also say that just in general, because this has been a historic problem in New York, we don't have enough poll sites for Election Day. So yes, we'll get some relief from early voting, but that won't get us all the way home, right? And we have 1,200, and to put it in perspective, we have 1,247 poll sites in New York City, and we have difficulty getting those. And we have 4.7 million voters. The city of Chicago has 1,500 poll sites for about 1.5 million voters, right? So we need to increase the pool of early voting sites, but we also need to increase the pool of election sites. And I don't say this by way of excuse, but I say it by way of explanation. We cannot do it all by ourselves. It's impossible. We can only designate those sites that we have legal authority to designate, and there's a folder on the desk. We saw it for the first time, primarily with the early voting sites, that has a stack of letters of entities objecting to being used as a poll site, particularly with respect to early voting and the fact that it is not just a 9-day period. It's a 9-day period multiple times. For locations in Queens, it'll be 9 days 4 times in 10 months. Not only that, it's just not 9 days. We need at least 1 day on the front end to deliver equipment and at least 1 day on the back end to pick it up. So it's really a minimum of 11.
And if I could just follow up, I understand the difficulty, and I've corresponded with you and your staff about this very issue, but assuming all that can be worked out, is there an ideal number of sites you are looking to increase for early voting purposes next year, or are we not at that point in the process?
We're not at that point in the process of the conversation with the commissioners. I do know that individual commissioners have individual ideas, and some of those have been expressed. The restriction on my mandate is unless and until at least 6 of them act in an affirmative way, I'm constrained from sharing that information. But I will say this. The desire for more poll sites has been heard loud and clear, or loudly and clearly, I think, right? And our commissioners are committed to making this process work. And I think the initial down payment on that commitment was well demonstrated this past election.
And last question, because I know there's some others that want to ask, is when do you expect that information to be available to us?
Well, the first thing that we're doing, quite frankly, is where we started this public commentary period. So that's going to allow us to gather some information. And we're looking, and I don't, Senator, do not mean to single out your borough, but because of the unique schedule for your borough this year of Queens, that's ratcheting up that time frame. So I would anticipate that would happen, sooner rather than later, because we're not viewing it now as an April deadline. We're viewing it more like a February deadline. So we got a couple of months. We're catching our breath a little bit. We got to certify this election. Yep.
The commissioners are also waiting on certain reports, analysis that's getting done. They have some reviewing to do as well. I mean, there's discussion of vote centers, and so that all has to be taken into consideration. But I don't think it would be past December.
Okay. Thank you. Not to
Or,
give you-
or much past December.
Not to give you
for
any
that
more
matter.
adjective, I'm sure you've thought of this, but if one of the many city council people running for borough president wins, you have another election in Queens to fill that seat. So
Your good wishes are
you got
always
your work
welcome,
cut out for
Senator.
you. Thank you.
Thank you. And I would be remiss as well if I did not mention that the support that we have received from the state legislature in the lead up, particularly to this most recent election, has been invaluable. And for those of you that have, and I don't want to single anybody out because I'm going to probably miss somebody, but for those of you that have taken the time to do that, I can't overstate how much that really means to our staff. That often gets unfairly maligned. So when that support comes, it really means something. And so thank you.